What happens when Hollywood royalty meets late-night comedy, and the conversation takes a turn nobody saw coming. What you're about to witness is one of the most uncomfortable moments in television history, where a simple interview becomes a battlefield of words and a legendary actress decides she's had enough. This is the story of how Candice Bergen walked off Steven Colbear's show, leaving everyone in the studio stunned and viewers at home wondering what just happened. Make sure to subscribe and drop a comment below because this story has more twists than you'd expect. It started like any other taping of The Late Show. Steven Colbear was in his element. The studio audience was warmed up and ready, and Candice Bergen was backstage preparing for what should have been a routine promotional appearance. She was there to talk about her latest project, a passion piece she'd been developing for years. The makeup artist put the finishing touches on her look, while the stage manager gave her the rundown of talking points they discussed during the pre-in. Just remember, the producer said, clipboard in hand. Steven loves to dive deep into political territory these days. He might ask about your past comments on certain issues. Candice nodded, adjusting her earrings. She'd been doing interviews for decades. There wasn't much that could rattle her anymore, or so she thought. The show's opening monologue went as expected. Steven delivered his usual mix of current events and sharp commentary, getting the audience laughing and engaged. When it came time to introduce his guest, his enthusiasm was genuine. Ladies and gentlemen, she's an Emmy-winning actress, a comedy legend, and someone who's never been afraid to speak her mind. Please welcome Candice Bergen. The applause was warm as Candice walked out, waving to the crowd with her characteristic grace. She settled into the guest chair, exchanging pleasantries with Steven as the audience quieted down. It's so great to have you here, Steven began, his trademark grin in place. I have to say, you look fantastic. What's the secret to staying so vibrant in this business? Well, Candice replied with a smile, I think it helps to stay curious, stay engaged with the world around you, and good genes don't hurt either. The audience chuckled, and Steven leaned forward. Speaking of staying engaged, I know you're someone who's never shied away from having opinions about the state of things. Your new project tackles some pretty heavy themes. It does, she agreed. I think art should reflect the complexity of human experience, including the uncomfortable parts we'd rather not examine. Absolutely. And you've certainly lived through some interesting times in this country. I'm curious about your perspective on how Hollywood has changed, particularly when it comes to speaking out on social issues. This was where the conversation began to shift. Candice's expression became more thoughtful. You know, Steven, I think there's a difference between having a platform and feeling obligated to use it in ways that might not be authentic to who you are as an artist. Steven's eyebrows raised slightly. Interesting. Can you elaborate on that? I think sometimes we get caught up in the idea that because we have visibility, we need to be activists first and artists second. But I've always believed that the best way to create change is through the work itself, through storytelling that opens minds rather than lectures that close them. The studio was quiet now, sensing that this wasn't going to be the typical lighthearted celebrity chat they'd expected. But surely, Steven pressed, you'd agree that silence in the face of injustice is complicity. Candice paused, considering her words carefully. I think that's a very black and white way of looking at a very gray world, Steven. And frankly, I'm surprised to hear you frame it that way. Something in her tone made Steven sit back slightly. The audience could feel the temperature in the room change. How so? He asked, his voice still friendly, but with an edge that wasn't there before. Because you're smarter than that, she said simply. You know that reducing complex social and political issues to sound bites and taking sides does nothing to advance actual dialogue or understanding. Steven's smile became more forced. Well, I think sometimes taking a stand is exactly what's needed. When you have a platform like yours or like mine, don't you think there's a responsibility that comes with it? There's a responsibility to be honest, Candice replied, her voice remaining calm but firm. And honestly, I think the entertainment industry has become so focused on virtue signaling that we've forgotten how to tell stories that actually matter too. People's lives. The phrase virtue signaling landed in the studio like a stone dropping into still water. Steven's expression shifted noticeably. That's quite an accusation, he said. And now the friendly host persona was starting to crack. Are you suggesting that people who use their platforms to advocate for causes they believe in are just performing? I'm suggesting, Candace said, leaning forward slightly, that when everyone is saying the same thing, using the same language, expressing outrage about the same issues in the same way, it stops being authentic expression and starts being conformity dressed up as activism. The silence in the studio was now palpable. Steven's writers and producers were likely scrambling behind the scenes, wondering where this conversation was headed and how to steer it back to safer territory. But Steven Colbear wasn't someone who backed down from a challenge, especially not on his own show. So what you're saying is that you think people like me, people who use humor and commentary to address serious issues, are just conformists pretending to care. I'm saying that I think you're more interesting when you're asking questions than when you're providing answers, Candace replied evenly. The words hung in the air like smoke after a gunshot. Steven's face went through a series of micro-expressions, confusion, irritation, and something that looked almost like hurt. The studio audience, trained to laugh at the right moments and applaud on cue, sat in uncomfortable silence, unsure of what they were witnessing. That's an interesting way to put it, Steven said, his voice tighter now. But I think asking questions and providing perspective aren't mutually exclusive. In fact, I'd argue that's exactly what good comedy does. I agree, Candace replied. And for a moment, it seemed like she might be backing down. When it's actually comedy. Steven's head tilted slightly. I'm sorry. What's that supposed to mean? It means that when you spend more time lecturing than laughing, more time telling your audience what to think than helping them think for themselves, you're not really doing comedy anymore. You're doing propaganda with a punchline. The intake of breath from the audience was audible. This had officially moved beyond uncomfortable television into something else entirely. Steven's producers were undoubtedly having emergency conversations through their headsets. Propaganda, Steven repeated slowly. That's quite a word to use about someone's work. Candace, it's quite a thing to do with a platform like yours, Steven. And what exactly do you think I should be doing with my platform? Just telling jokes about airline food and avoiding anything that matters. I think you should be doing whatever feels authentic to you, she said. But I also think you should be honest about what you're doing. If you want to be a political commentator who occasionally tells jokes, own that. But don't pretend you're still primarily a comedian when your show has become a nightly sermon to the choir. Steven's composure was beginning to crack more visibly now. His hands, which had been gesturing naturally throughout their conversation, were now clenched together on his desk. You know what I find interesting about this critique, he said, his voice taking on a sharper edge, is that it's coming from someone who built a career playing a character who was literally a mouthpiece for liberal values on television. Murphy Brown was a fictional character, Candace replied without missing a beat. She wasn't claiming to deliver objective truth or unbiased commentary. The audience knew they were watching a scripted character with scripted opinions. There's a difference between entertainment with a point of view and news commentary disguised as entertainment. So now I'm disguising news commentary as entertainment? I'm saying that when the line between journalism and comedy becomes so blurred that audiences can't tell the difference, we have a problem. And when comedians start believing they're journalists, we have an even bigger problem. Steven leaned back in his chair, studying her with an expression that mixed frustration with something approaching fascination. You know, I'm trying to figure out if you actually believe what you're saying or if you're just trying to be provocative. I'm trying to have an honest conversation, Candace said. Something that seems to be increasingly rare in this business. Honest conversation, Steven repeated. Okay, let's be honest then. You're essentially arguing that people with platforms shouldn't use them to advocate for things they believe in. You're arguing for a kind of moral neutrality that frankly sounds a lot like complicity to me. I'm arguing for intellectual honesty and artistic integrity, she shot back, her calm demeanor showing the first signs of strain. And I'm arguing against the kind of groupthink that's turned Hollywood into an echo chamber where everyone pats themselves on the back for having the same opinions. Groupthink, Steven said. And now there was no mistaking the irritation in his voice. So, everyone who disagrees with your perspective is engaging in groupthink. Everyone who's afraid to disagree with the prevailing orthodoxy is engaging in groupthink. Yes. And what orthodoxy is that exactly? You know what it is, Steven. We all do. The unspoken list of acceptable opinions, acceptable targets, acceptable ways of thinking about complex issues. The understanding that certain viewpoints are career-ending while others are career-enhancing. Steven's jaw tightened. Are you seriously suggesting that people in this industry are only expressing progressive viewpoints because they're afraid not to? I'm suggesting that when dissent becomes professionally dangerous, you don't have a diversity of thought. You have conformity enforced through social pressure. And you think that's what I'm doing? Enforcing conformity. I think you've become very comfortable being applauded for saying things your audience already agrees with, Candace said, her voice still measured, but carrying more weight now. And I think that's made you less curious about perspectives that might challenge those assumptions. The audience was completely silent now, watching this verbal tennis match between two people who clearly respected each other's intelligence, but were fundamentally disagreeing about something much deeper than entertainment. Steven took a deep breath. And when he spoke again, his voice had a dangerous calm to it. You know what I think is happening here, Candace? I think you're confusing moral clarity with conformity. I think you're mistaking taking a stand with groupthink. And I think you're using the language of intellectual independence to avoid taking responsibility for the impact of staying silent on issues that actually matter to people's lives. And I think, Candace replied, her own composure beginning to show cracks, that you're confusing self-righteousness with moral clarity. I think you're mistaking echo chamber validation with having impact. And I think you've forgotten the difference between challenging power and performing for people who already agree with you. The studio felt electric now, charged with a tension that neither the host nor the guest seemed interested in diffusing. Steven Unk's writers were probably scrambling to figure out how to get this interview back on track. But both participants seemed committed to seeing this through to whatever conclusion it was heading toward. Performance, Steven said slowly. That's what you think this is? I think, Candace said, and now her voice carried a note of something that might have been disappointment, that you've become so invested in being right that you've stopped being curious about being wrong. Those words landed like a slap. Steven Unk's face went completely still, and for a moment, the only sound in the studio was the hum of the cameras and the barely audible breathing of an audience. Curious about being wrong, Steven repeated, his voice dangerously quiet. That's rich coming from someone who's spent the last 15 minutes telling me everything. Just criticism wrapped up in intellectual superiority. I'm not here to solve your problem, Steven, Candace replied, and there was steel in her voice now. I'm here because you invited me to talk about my work, and instead you've spent this entire interview trying to get me to validate your approach to yours. My approach, Steven said, his composure finally cracking completely, is to use whatever influence I have to speak up for people who don't have a voice. My approach is to call out injustice when I see it, even when it's uncomfortable, when it costs me viewers or makes me unpopular with certain demographics. Your approach, Candace countered, leaning forward in her chair, is to perform outrage for an audience that rewards you for it. Your approach is to punch down at easy targets while convincing yourself you're speaking truth to power. The accusation hung in the air like a challenge. Steven Unk's hands were flat on his desk now, his knuckles white. Punch down, he said slowly. Who exactly do you think I'm punching down at, Candace? Anyone who asks uncomfortable questions about the orthodoxies you've helped establish. Anyone who refuses to perform the kind of ideological purity that gets rewarded in this industry. So now I'm enforcing ideological purity. You're rewarding it. The audience shifted uncomfortably, unsure if this was part of the show or if they were witnessing something genuinely going off the rails. You know what, Candace? I think what's really happening here is that you're upset that the world has moved past the kind of both sides false equivalency that used to pass for sophistication in this town. I think you're frustrated that audiences today actually expect their entertainers to have principles and aren't satisfied with empty cleverness anymore. Candace remained seated, but her posture straightened. And I think you've convinced yourself that having the right opinions is the same thing as having principles. I think you've mistaken being popular with your base for being brave. Being brave, Steven repeated, his voice rising slightly. Tell me about being brave, Candace. Who actually put themselves on the line every night to address the issues that matter. The issues that matter to whom, Steven, to your audience, to your network, or to the people whose lives are actually affected by the policies and politicians you mock from your comfortable perch in Manhattan. That was the moment. Something shifted in Steven Unk's expression, a hardening that suggested they'd crossed a line neither of them had intended to cross. My comfortable perch, he said, his voice low and controlled in a way that was somehow more unsettling than if he'd been shouting. You mean this job that I work at every day? Trying to make sense of an increasingly senseless world for people who are scared and confused and looking for some kind of guidance or at least some relief. I mean this platform that insulates you from the consequences of your rhetoric while allowing you to feel morally superior to everyone who doesn't share your certainties. My certainties, Steven said, and now he was moving around the desk toward her chair. The audience was completely silent, some of them looking toward the exits as if they sensed they shouldn't be witnessing this. My certainty that racism is wrong. My certainty that people deserve health care. My certainty that democracy is worth defending. Your certainty that you understand complex issues better than the millions of people who disagree with you, Candace replied, her voice never wavering. Your certainty that your moral framework is the only valid one. Your certainty that anyone who questions your assumptions must be motivated by ignorance or malice. Steven stopped moving, standing now just a few feet from her chair. And what's your framework, Candace? What's your grand philosophy? Sitting on the sidelines and critiquing everyone who actually gives a damn. My philosophy is that art should complicate rather than simplify. That entertainment should challenge rather than confirm. That intelligence means being humble about how much you don't know, not arrogant about how much you do. Humble, Steven said, and there was something like a laugh in his voice, but not a pleasant one. The irony of you lecturing me about humility while sitting there acting like you're the only person in this industry with any intellectual integrity is apparently lost on you. That was when Candice Bergen did something no one in the studio expected. She smiled. Not a friendly smile, not a diplomatic smile, but the kind of smile that suggested she'd been waiting for this moment. You know what, Steven? You're absolutely right. The irony is lost on me, just like the irony is lost on you. You've spent this entire interview proving every point I've made about what's wrong with the way this industry approaches these conversations. She stood up, removing her microphone with practiced ease. What are you doing? Steven asked, his anger suddenly replaced by confusion. I'm leaving, she said simply, setting the mic on the chair. Because this conversation was supposed to be about my work, but you couldn't help turning it into a referendum on yours. Because you couldn't hear a critique without making it personal. Because you've proven that you're more interested in being right than being thoughtful. The studio was dead silent now. Candace, wait, Steven said, his host instincts finally kicking in. Look, if I've offended you, that wasn't my intention. We're having a discussion. We can disagree and still be civil about it. She paused halfway to the exit and turned back to face him. Civility isn't the issue here, Steven. The issue is that you invited me on your show and then spent the entire time trying to get me to agree with you instead of actually listening to what I was saying. The issue is that you can't imagine that someone might disagree with you for reasons other than moral failing or intellectual inadequacy. That's not true, Steven protested. But his voice lacked conviction. Isn't it? She asked. Then tell me one thing I've said tonight that you've actually considered might be valid. The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of everything they'd said and everything they couldn't take back. That's what I thought, Candace said quietly. I hope you got something out of this, even if it wasn't what anyone expected. And with that, she walked off the stage, leaving Steven Colbear standing alone in front of his desk, his audience, and his cameras, trying to figure out how a routine interview had become something else entirely. So, what do you think? Was Candice Bergen out of line for walking off? Or did Steven Colbear push too hard and prove her point about the state of discourse in entertainment?